that, I'd like to introduce David Cross of Indispensable Leadership. David is an author and historian who created the speaker series in partnership with Washington Memorial Heritage. He's also the mastermind behind the very well-regarded Philly Bowtie Tours. One tour participant said in reviewing it online that David talks about the Founding Fathers like he went to college with them. But I can assure you that he's not that old. So please join me in welcoming David Cross. Okay.
Thank you all so much. It's great to see you all here. When I did start Bowtie Tours, it was originally a company that did tours inside Old City, and we did the basic tour. And that's what so many people think about in terms of the revolution. Like 28% of you know, because I know 28% of you actually clicked on the email I sent you all. But like 28% of you know, John Adams says that independence occurred in 1775 before a shot was fired. And that is such an exciting part of what we study. But what occurred to me as we started the company was there's so many amazing battlefields out here involving the American Revolution. You live in a place that's closer to more major battlefields than any place in America, probably, of the Revolution. And you know, there's so many people that are obsessed with the Civil War and the Civil War battlefields, but people have this misunderstanding that it wasn't that violent, it wasn't that bad, the Revolution. And sure, the numbers are completely different from the Civil War, but when you start to look into the battles, you find out that it is just a riveting story, how George Washington does what he does, how the colonies win this war. And that's where this speaker today comes in. When we started to make these tours, first thing we purchased was his 2-volume book on the subject, which we call the Bible. Because that's what we go to, that's what we went to make these tours, and that's what we still go to, and that's what we will constantly go to. So it's very exciting for me to actually meet him here and see he's an actual living human being, not somebody who never actually existed, because I owe so much to you because of those 2 books. I can't even tell you how many times I've gone back to them. Tom went to Villanova University. He has authored 6 books: The Surprise of Germantown, The Battle of Paoli, Brandywine Battlefield State Park Trail of History Guide, and The Philadelphia Campaign. That's 2 volumes. And let me say to people, battle books can be tough, right? I mean, there's some people, when they write them, they're just painful. And that is not these books, because Tom's able to really bring in the characters of the people, which is what excites me about them so much, about the battles, about history. I like to know the people. I like to know what drives them. And his books, they give you the battle information. They're good for the people I call the C-SPAN 3ers, you know, the ones that watch the national park person in Gettysburg at 3 a.m. But they're also people good for people who aren't that capable to understand battles. So Tom has also served as vice president and historian of the Paoli Battlefield Preservation Fund. And he served as guest curator at the Chester County Historical Society for the exhibition War Comes to Chester County 1777 to 1778. He went to Malvern, and now he teaches at Malvern. And I want you to give him a warm round of applause.
I've been called a lot of things, but the author of the Bible is the latest one. I had on a service trip to Fiji, I had one of the people we worked with was an Indo-Fijian woman who was Hindu, and when she was talking to my students, she referred to me as their guru. So this takes it up a notch. Okay. Imagine, if you will, where you're sitting right now, 245 years ago today. April 13th, 1778. Take a deep breath. You would smell this encampment and run in whatever direction the wind wasn't blowing. Washington's army was here April of 1778. If you had looked out there during the day, you would have seen troops maneuvering around with a rather comical German guy screaming and yelling at them in French and German and cursing in English to teach these guys a standard drill, Baron von Steuben. This place looked like a badly built town, according to a British officer that came through here as a prisoner a year later. And in April 1778, the total number of people in this camp probably was around 13,000 to 14,000. That includes 3,000 to 4,000 women and children. Infantry, musket men who are able to be considered fit for duty, meaning they are completely dressed, is probably around 8,000 or 9,000. There's probably 3,000 or 4,000 others who aren't fit to be seen in public. That was going to change because, as you heard, you're going to celebrate the French alliance in May. It was May 6th that the army formed up out on these hills here and did a big celebration for the French alliance. And before they left this camp, apparently supply ships arrived from France with 20,000 uniforms. So the guys marched out of here in brown coats and blue coats with red facings for the most part, from what we can tell. So they were pretty well dressed, pretty well drilled. And 10 days after they left here, they take on the British Army at the Battle of Monmouth, which is the other biggest battle of the American Revolution other than Brandywine. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so I wanted to put you in a time and a place. The other thing is, this room is where I first started my history career. In 1975. This was the Valley Forge Historical Society's museum, and where we're standing and sitting, Washington's tent was right here in a case. Some of you may remember that. If you go down to the Museum of the American Revolution, it's spectacular. Nothing short of spectacular. I know the director and the curators there, and in fact the historic preservation class I teach, when we go down to the museum, they show us stuff in the back rooms, including 2 paintings that used to hang in this back room back in the 1970s, the Battle of Paoli and the Battle of Germantown by Xavier Delegata, who up until about 4 years ago, we didn't know who those paintings were made for. We assumed a British officer. The research they did opened a story that is just beyond belief of an Anglo-Irish officer, Richard Mansard St. George, who was in the Battle of Paoli and Brandywine, got badly wounded in the head at Germantown and suffered for the rest of his life with PTSD, for lack of a better description. They managed to find his descendants in Ireland who opened up a vista, including a portrait of St. George that was done the year after he went back over there with his head wrapped in a black silk cap, and all you got to do is look at him. PTSD. But those are the connections, where the story of what we knew of the revolution from the society acquiring those paintings and not knowing much to building. There's still a lot of this story to be told. And what we're going to do tonight is touch on the Philadelphia campaign. So let's get underway. One of my favorite quotes from a young British officer, British grenadier officer, said, "Figure to yourself 2 large armies, the one flying from the other and both sweeping all before them. Not only the present stock is destroyed, but all the young cattle, the future dependency of the province. Desolation triumphs all around, nor will a century repair the loss America has sustained in population and commerce." When David commented about, or talking about, the Civil War is much bigger, yes, it was. There were more people here, and you had photography and all that stuff. The American Revolution was as violent as any war you're going to find, and in many ways, worse. Medical care. I don't need to say anymore. Okay. This encampment was the most fatal encampment Washington's army had during the whole war. The documents that they were able to gather to document deaths, 1,529. The historians, you always have to give an allowance there of about 10%. So about 2,000 of Washington's soldiers died as a result of this encampment. Most of them died outside the camp. They got sick in camp and were taken to hospitals and died there. So if you go out to Yellow Springs, there's mass graves there. Bethlehem, Reading, Lancaster, some of the local Quaker meeting houses, Euclid Meeting, that was a hospital for a while. Ephrata Cloister got annihilated. Half of the brothers and sisters there died of camp disease because Continental soldiers came in with typhus and typhoid fever, and it destroyed their community. But they were heroic doing what they did. Anyway, this desolation was real, and it came right through here. A British Army engineer, Archibald Robertson, his drawings are up in the New York Public Library. He did 62 wash drawings similar to this one. This is July 2nd, 1777, and what you have are some British troops sitting on a hillside here overlooking the Narrows. The Verrazano Narrows Bridge is right there now. It's on Staten Island. And there's British ships there, which in a week after this was taken or painted, the British Army is going to start getting on board the ships in preparation to come down to Philadelphia. Now, military intelligence is one of those things that plagues military history. It's that oxymoron. The British started to board the ships July 8th. They didn't set sail till July 22nd down to Sandy Hook, right off of the coast of North Jersey. And that's the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, which is the oldest lighthouse in America. That was built in the 1760s, so that was there. There were about 18,000 British troops, 267 ships. And if you can imagine a room this size with 300 guys trying to sleep in here with a ceiling this low, and they're on those ships, bobbing up and down off of Staten Island from July 8th till July 22nd in July heat, yeah. Woo, nasty. I always tell my students, if a hockey locker room smells the way that it does, what does a transport ship smell like in those days? Okay, this is pretty rough stuff, all right? The British officers complain as this fleet starts down the coast and gets slower and slower that they were told to lay in for 3 weeks of fresh provisions. The voyage is going to take 6 weeks. And they're going to run out of fresh food and fresh water into the 4th week. Again, pretty nasty stuff. So here's how they do it. The fleet departs Sandy Hook and goes down the coast of Jersey. Now, you can drive from Sandy Hook down to Atlantic City today in about 2.5 to 3 hours. It took the fleet until July 25th, 2 days to get down there. There was a rider named John Hunn who Congress sent down to see if he could spot the British fleet. Where was it going? They didn't know where it was going. Hal didn't tell anybody except his brother, the admiral. They had learned if you want to keep a secret, don't tell anybody anything. So it kept Washington guessing. It kept the British generals guessing. And then we get down here, July 25th, and the fleet disappears. And then it shows up off of Cape May, July 30th. So it took a whole week to go from Sandy Hook down to Cape May by water, which in normal times might be a day and a half, not 7 days. And again, it's July and August, and this was a terribly hot summer. They're going to hang out in the Delaware Bay there for 2 or 3 days. Riders go back to Philadelphia. They go up to Washington's army, and Washington was up in the area near Morristown at that point, and he marches the army down as fast as they can in 90-degree heat, 20 miles a day. And they get down to Philadelphia August the 2nd, only to find out the British fleet has disappeared again. And it's going to disappear for another 10 days. They have no idea where it went. Down at Cape Henlopen, this lighthouse was there in those days. That lighthouse has since disappeared. They show up off of Cape Henlopen in that area August the 1st. They put to sea and they disappear. August 8th, they're sighted off the southern coast of Maryland. August 14th, they finally enter the Chesapeake Bay. And then up the Chesapeake Bay, it's going to take them 10 days. It's not their fault. It was the weather. You can blame global warming if you want. Contrary winds and our wonderful North American summer thunderstorms, which terrified even us. We grew up with them. The Europeans couldn't believe how violent they were, especially every so often a ship got hit, including Admiral Howe's flagship, the Eagle. They get up off of Annapolis, August the 21st, then off of Baltimore, August 22nd, and finally, August the 24th, they get up to Head of Elk, and they land on the 25th. Washington's army had been north of Philadelphia, then they went up to Neshaminy because they got word that Burgoyne's force was coming down and they needed help to stop him. And literally the day Washington ordered the army to march north, a rider came in and said the British are in the Chesapeake. News travels, it's amazing. The news of them at Cape Henlopen got to Washington in 24 hours, 160 miles. They had relay riders. But this kind of news, you're not going to get there from Southern Virginia, probably for 2 weeks by land. The British land at Head of Elk. They spend a couple of days there because the men were absolutely seasick. They had lost over 400 horses in the voyage that died and had to be chucked overboard. They had to gather forage, and the guys went on plundering expeditions, even though they were forbidden to. The British Army cracked down on them. The Hessian commander, General Knyphausen, he cracked down. He had a couple guys executed, and that slowed it down. Now, you'll hear a lot about the British plundering coming through this area, and there was a lot. What you don't hear about is the fact that Continental troops were doing it too. September 4th, when Washington's army is at Wilmington, he launches a tirade in the general orders that's 4 pages long about our own troops plundering our own people. And he said, why did we assemble in arms? It wasn't it to stop this kind of stuff. So he threatened any guy caught plundering with death. 4 times in September 1777, he has to reiterate that in the general orders. The discipline in the Continental Army is not good. The ethnic issues and religious issues are not good. The Pennsylvania line were some of the worst offenders. They would go after the Quakers here, or they went after the Germans. So that kind of stuff, there's a lot of tension going on under the scenes there. No surprise. But in the midst of that, you also have in the Continental Army officers who are grumbling about rank, about seniority, and as Washington described them, the summer of 1777, shoals of French officers were coming over here. And Congress was giving them commissions left, right, and center. And the craziest one was a 19-year-old Frenchman named Marquis de Lafayette. That was him for short. His real name is about that long. His father had been a soldier, got killed in the Battle of Minden in 1759. Lafayette had never been in battle. He was friends with the King and Queen of France, so Congress made him a major general without any troops to command. When you talk about political correctness, it's nothing new. They did it to butter up the French. If you read Washington's letters, those first letters about Lafayette, he liked them, but he had no clue what to do with this kid. Brandywine is going to prove Lafayette's real commitment here, but that's coming down the road. There's skirmishing near Couch's Bridge in Delaware. The British establish a camp by Newark. Washington digs entrenchments at Newport and Wilmington, hoping to block the British advance to Philadelphia. And no sooner are we set to take them on than General Howe decides to sidestep them and simply go around and up towards Kennett Square. So Washington has to shift his army up from Wilmington up to Chadds Ford. So here's the setup for September 11th. Washington positions his army like so. He's got about 15,000 troops, about 11,000 Continental regulars and 3,000 militia, mostly Pennsylvania militia, who don't have clue one which end of the musket to hold, let alone any combat experience. Many of the Continentals are in the same boat, but there's other Continentals who are 2.5-year veterans. So it's a mixed bag in the Continental Army. Don't let numbers fool you. The British Army, on the other hand, is 18,000, and it's Hessian troops and British troops and American loyalists. Well-trained, well-fed, well-equipped, and they know exactly what they're doing. Howe, who was a light infantry expert, he and his brother had developed it during the French and Indian War, he's going to pull a classic light infantry move. Send your part of your army towards the front of your enemy, keep their attention, but go around their flank with a wide punch. So Lord Cornwallis is going to take 8,000 of the best troops that the British have, all their grenadiers, all the Hessian grenadiers, all the British light infantry, and the Hessian riflemen called Jaegers. They're going to go up through the countryside, and local loyalists are going to show them the roads. And they get around Washington's flank. The end result here is General Knyphausen is down here at Chadds Ford. Cornwallis, with 8,000 of these really super troops, is now up on Washington's flank and in his rear. Washington was warned that this was happening, and he actually came up with a strategy to attack Knyphausen And then another report came in and said that Cornwallis wasn't up there, so he hesitated. And by the time he got it confirmed, it was too late. He's going to order General Sullivan and Lord Stirling and General Adam Stephen to try to rendezvous up by Birmingham Meeting House. They're trying to find each other blind, and if you know the Chadds Ford area, it's all hills and woods and so on, and there are dirt roads in those days. How they found each other was a miracle. But there are 3,000 American troops here now in a disjointed battle line against 8,000 crack British troops. So when this attack happens, a British officer of the Guards, Ensign Lord Cantilupe, painted this little watercolor into his diary. It's up in a library in northern England. And it's called A Battery of the Rebels on Brandywine Heights in the county of Birmingham, 11th of September. And what it shows down on the bottom there is actually little strokes of red. It's the Guards firing a volley up a hill, what's now called Birmingham Hill. And there's 3 American cannons in that hill, in that cloud of smoke. You see the red flashes. And then there's all these little stick figures that you'll see. That's handsome Lord Cantilupe. By the way, there's a little crown behind him with a D under it. His father was Lord de la Warr. His great-grandfather was Thomas de la Warr, that the Delaware River and Bay are named after. Okay, and his father died in November of 1777. His father was the top soldier in the British Army, colonel of the Horse Guards. And when he died, young Lord Cantilupe, I think he was 21, he inherited the title of Earl de la Warr while he's in Philadelphia. Probably the first member of the family to actually come over here. But he did this, and this British engineer, Archibald Robertson, in drawing this map, this is, let me back that up a second there. This is part of Robertson's map that shows the Guards coming across. This is Route 926 now, Street Road, going up Battle Hill there. Okay. That part of the Continental Army was Maryland troops under General Deborah. They fell apart. Deborah was 70 years old. He barely spoke English, and he did a maneuver here that Sullivan got blamed for. His troops were not in proper formation when the Guards hit them. And the Guards had 1,000 guys. And Howe told these guys a year earlier when they landed in New York, fix your bayonets, load once, fire once, maybe twice, and rush the rebels. They can't stand bayonet attacks. Bingo. Breaks the line right there. Here's close-ups of that little watercolor. Skirmishers, so just little stick figures. And then this British officer, Guards officer, Sir George Osborne, tells us, we attacked the left flank of the rebel army and raining down on the brigades of Sullivan, a French General Deborah, and Maxwell, with an impetuosity really it would have been scarcely possible for them to resist. I had but 1 grenadier wounded. The light company who were with me had only 3. There are accounts after this battle that the British lost 2,000 men. No, they didn't. They lost barely 500. The American army lost double that. And the reason was what I just told you. General Howe told these guys, you march, you advance, you fire 1 volley, and then charge with bayonets. We're going to have to get as good as they are with it. When Lafayette was in this battle, when this flank attack happened, he was at headquarters when the report came in, and Washington's trying to figure out, he orders Greene and Nash to get up there to help Sullivan. And Lafayette asks if it's okay if he goes up there. I don't think Washington had a whole lot of time to babysit a 19-year-old at that point. Basically said, yes, just don't get hurt. Famous last words. Well, Lafayette went up there, and his account tells us the American troops did not have their bayonets on, and he and the young French aides that were with him were trying to show the guys how to put their bayonets on, which may be a slight exaggeration, but you get the point. The American troops that were in Sullivan's thing, this is the Maryland Brigade, they're going to fall apart. New Jersey troops are here, and Conway's Pennsylvania Brigade are here. They're going to stand firm. The Virginians are over here under Adam Stephen. They're going to stand firm. And they're actually going to blunt this British attack, first with British light infantry that get pinned down there, and Hessian Jaegers coming up there on the flank. Jaegers are Hessian riflemen who are very, very good, sharpshooters, dressed in green. They pin the light infantry and the Jaegers down for almost 45 minutes. Then the Grenadiers and the Guards hit this American flank. 1,200 British grenadiers supported by 1,500 Hessian grenadiers and 1,000 guards. Okay, and with a disorganized Maryland line, the Marylanders fell apart. Once that happened, the guards in the 1st Grenadier Battalion continue on, pushing down to Chadds Ford. The other Grenadier Battalion goes around the American flanks. The Americans have to pull back. That's flank attack. Here we go. The minute you get around the other guy's line and go for their rear, they have to pull back or be cut off. The British did this very well at this battle. But several of the British and Hessian officers' accounts say the American troops here had never fought so well before. They really held their ground. Some of them ran, but some of them didn't. And when you get down to the nitty-gritty, it's these guys who have experience. And there is some discipline. General Conway, who becomes notorious because of the Conway Cabal, Conway was critical of Washington because he actually drilled his brigade. He made the guys do the drill. That's why they did so well here. The New Jersey troops were so furious at what had happened in New Jersey with plundering for the previous year. They're fighting like maniacs here. And the Virginians, Washington can't say a word about them because people accuse them of favoritism. But boy, they dug in and did a good job too. But they eventually have to fall back. Greene is going to come up from Chadds Ford to try to bolster the line, leaving Anthony Wayne with 2 Pennsylvania brigades and the American light infantry at Chadds Ford. And as this attack is deafeningly loud, everybody on both sides said they never heard such gunfire. It was like the roaring of, how did they say it? It was like a windstorm, because they're firing what are called platoons, volley after volley after volley in short spurts, plus the artillery. They could hear this clearly in Philadelphia, which really shook everybody up. Wayne's troops are going to hold as firm as they can, but once that heavy firing started, Knyphausen pushed across at Chadds Ford. Wayne's troops held firm until the Guards show up on his flank. The Guards get the award. They were in both parts of this battle. The total distance they went on foot that day was about 25 miles. And that was an 80-degree day, very much like today. And they're carrying 60 pounds of stuff, and they're on dirt roads up and down those hills. Needless to say, as it was getting dark, and the Virginians and the Pennsylvania State Regiment bolstered the American line over there where you see Greene, some of the heaviest fighting in the Battle of Brandywine happens over there. It's now Oakland Road, right near Harvey Road. And it's going to stop the British advance. But it was getting dark anyway. And one of the British light infantry officers said the men were blown. They were utterly exhausted chasing the Americans over hill and dale and having fought this battle. So the British win the battle. We lost over 1,000 men, probably between 200 and 300 killed, 400 to 600 wounded, and the British, actually there's a number, they captured 315 prisoners. One of them actually broke down what nationalities they were. The Irish get the award. There are 134 Irishmen captured. The Germans were faster, apparently. Only 34 of them got captured. But devastating loss? Yeah, Washington loses about 15% of his army. Does the army fall apart? Almost, but not quite. The miracle here is these guys stay together in spite of these losses. And they're going to retreat from Chadds Ford that night down the Chester. In the midst of all that, Lafayette's aide pointed out that blood was pouring out the top of his boot. And he looked down and he was shot through the calf of the leg. In doing my research, especially in the pension papers, I found out the real reason we lost the Battle of Brandywine. I can't tell you how many guys helped Lafayette off the field because he was wounded. Hundreds of them did. It was like a mosh pit passing him down to Chester. The number of these guys claiming in their pensions that they helped Lafayette off the field, even when you find out they're in a regiment that's 5 miles from wherever it was that Lafayette got wounded. It's one of those legendary things, but the army fell in love with him with that, okay? Because he shed his blood. He's a handsome, young, idealistic French officer. There were other French officers that nobody liked at all. Prudhomme de Bora is going to resign. The Marylanders are going to cheer. A guy by the name of de Courdray, who was a really arrogant French engineer that Congress took into its head to put him in charge of the river defenses, it prompted 3 of Washington's top officers to threaten resignation and caused a big political battle. Fortunately, Deborah accidentally drowned on September 16th. He wouldn't get off his horse and he rode onto a ferry boat near Philadelphia, and the horse kept going into the Schuylkill River. And that was the end of De Courdray. It solved certain problems that were otherwise intractable. The morning after Brandywine, Washington's army marches 25 miles from Chester area up to East Falls. They cross the Schuylkill at Middle Ferry, where 30th Street is now. Now remember, Philadelphia in those days is just what's now Old City and Society Hill, a bit of Northern Liberties, and a bit of what's now called Queen Village. Where City Hall is, that was countryside. That was half a mile from the buildings, okay? So 30th Street Station, Market Street there, that's a mile and a half from Philadelphia. The rest of it's beautiful countryside. And there's these lovely houses, some of them farmhouses and some of them these summer houses like Cliveden or Mount Pleasant or Belmont Mansion and so on. So Washington's army goes up to East Falls. The British stay at Brandywine for the next 5 days. They take the wounded and send them down to Wilmington. By that time, Admiral Howe's fleet had gone back down the Chesapeake and came up the Delaware River to Wilmington. About 2,000 British and Hessian troops are sent to Wilmington to occupy it. And between the casualties, maybe 500 at Brandywine and then 2,000 at Wilmington, the British Army is now down to about 14,000. Okay? But they're still pretty dangerous. But they sit for 5 days. It gave Washington the chance to rally, recross the Schuylkill, come up through what's now Marion and Haverford Townships. September 14th, they're camped along the old Lancaster Road and Conestoga Road in what's now Radnor and Haverford Township. Headquarters for Washington was at the Buck Tavern. The next day, they move up into the Great Valley, and they're in the area between the White Horse Tavern in Fraser and the Paoli Tavern. Now, again, you got to remember, between the number of troops plus wagons plus officers and all that, when this army is on a march, if it's on one road, it could be 10 miles long. Because people will argue and say, they camped in Marion. No, they didn't. They camped in Radnor. And the answer is both. This is not 10 guys, as a reenactor regiment. This is an army. Part of the Continental Army's baggage train showed up in Bethlehem right around this time. They were sent to the rear. Part of it, 700 wagons. Do the math. Each of those wagons had 4 horses and 2 teamsters. How many horses is that? How much manure does a horse drop every day? Start doing the math and you start realizing, holy smokes. Bethlehem only had 600 people in it in those days, and it suddenly has 2,000 or 3,000 added. Wounded from Brandywine, including Lafayette and General Woodford, are going to be sent up to Bethlehem. Congress, as you'll see in a minute, when they flee Philadelphia, they're going to be in Bethlehem for a little bit. But that's coming down the road. 5 days after Brandywine, Washington puts his army to block the river crossings here. Fatland Ford, Swedes Ford. Fatland Ford's right down below us here on the Schuylkill River. Swedes Ford is Norristown. That was the best ford on the Schuylkill River. It was shallow, it had a hard stone bottom, and it went straight across. Fatland Ford here, you went into the river, it went up to your waist. There was an island there. You went down the island, then back into the river. And a number of the other fords, same thing. But Swedes Ford was the best one. So Washington guessed, and correctly guessed, Howe was probably going to head for Swedes Ford. There's no bridges across the Schuylkill in those days. The two armies converge in Goshen Township, and just as it looks like another major battle is about to occur, a nor'easter blows in. Not quite a hurricane and bigger than a thunderstorm. It was windy and the rain came down in buckets, so it becomes known as the Battle of the Clouds. Washington's army, because of its equipment, lost 400,000 cartridges. The army's firepower totally ruined. The British had waterproof cartridge boxes, and they also all had bayonets, and they were trained. Fortunately, Howe basically told his men, take shelter wherever you can find it. So they crammed in the barns and houses and into the woods in this deluge. Washington's army had to slog from basically where Immaculata College is all the way out to Chester Springs in the dark on dirt roads, Backton Hill Road and Bodine Road and so forth, and Yellow Springs Road. It took them 14 hours to go 6 miles. Lots of the guys lost their shoes, sucked off in the mud, utterly exhausted and soaked. One of the loyalists with the British camp says, as wet as water could make me, he went from one house to another looking for shelter along Boot Road. And he just said it that way. John Lawrence asked his father a couple of weeks later to send him a new waistcoat because the white one that he had was discolored, much disfigured by the dye that washed out of my hat during this retreat to Yellow Springs. Okay, so it tells you it was a dark, miserable night. The army gets to Yellow Springs and not a dry round of ammunition. Where can they get new ammunition? At a place called Reading Furnace, which is right out near Hopewell Village, way out there. Another slog on flooded roads, about 15, 16 miles the next day. Washington wrote from Reading Furnace when he sent Wayne to get behind the British Army. Wayne told him, the British are in Tredyffrin. If you come up with the main army, we can pin them against the Schuylkill. Washington's answer was, I'll move as fast as I can with jaded men. It was an understatement. The guys were utterly exhausted. So anyway, the British stayed at Goshen September 16th and into the 17th. And then, this is as the Americans go out to the French Creek Valley and then out to Reading Furnace, which is not near Reading, by the way. It's right off of Route 23, near Elverson. The British on the 18th are going to move down into the Great Valley at the White Horse Tavern, which is still there at Swedesford Road and Plainbrook Road. They're going to rendezvous their 2 columns and then go over what was then the Lancaster Road, is now Swedesford Road. And right at the fork where Route 401 and Swedesford Road fork, they're going to fork. And Lord Cornwallis is going to take the Grenadiers and these troops up the Lancaster Road, past the Paoli Tavern, and up here into the heights of Tredyffrin. Howe and Kniphausen go down here, the lower heights, down in the Great Valley. So this is the British camp at Tredyffrin. And it will also show you the attack made by Major General Gray against the rebels. And it says near the White Horse Tavern. This is the Battle of Paoli. The Battle of Paoli had a couple of names at the time. This was one of them. They're just named after landmarks. The Battle of Paoli was 1.75 miles from the Paoli Tavern. It's in what's now the town of Malvern. Okay, Wayne brings the two Pennsylvania brigades, about 2,200 men, down to the Paoli Tavern the night of September 18th and 19th, gets within 3 miles of the back of this British camp and sends a letter to Washington and said, the enemy are washing and cooking. Bring the army down here, we can crush them. Now that's typical Wayne, okay? He also says at the end of that letter, if Howe attempts to move, I will attack him. Really, Anthony? That's why they call him Mad Anthony. He's got 2,200 guys. He's going to attack 15,000 British regulars and Hessians. That's Anthony. You got to get the EpiPen out every so often with Anthony. He has a tendency to really... Every time there was a council of war, when Washington would ask each general their opinion, should we attack or not, every time they asked Wayne his opinion, his answer was the same. Fight, sir. That was it. When the Stony Point thing happened in 1779, Washington asked Wayne, he knew Wayne was a bit of a hothead, and he basically said, what do you think about if we, tried to attack Stony Point? And Anthony Wayne's famous answer was, I'll storm hell if you'll plan it. Okay. We know what Wayne's answer is going to be. Wayne obviously was from this area. He lived about 1 mile from the Paoli Tavern, and midday of September 19th, there was an alarm in the British camp, and Wayne decided to move back. He wasn't sure if he'd been spotted yet, and he sets himself up. Whoops, let's back that up for a second. Sets himself up right here in the woods above where Malvern Prep is right now. So he's 4 miles behind the British Army. The night of September 18th, as Wayne was moving towards them, a British patrol came over here from this British camp at Tredyffrin. Now, this is another map of that same camp, but it's from the opposite direction. North is to the bottom. This is Swedesford Road. Route 202 comes right here. Here's Howellville, okay? The 202 exit onto 252 is right there, okay? Gateway Shopping Center is right over here. So that's where you are. Contention Lane, right about here. The guy who drew this map is none other than Captain John Andre, who later became Major Andre, who got hanged. Okay? He was the aide of General Charles Gray on this campaign. He kept a journal, which is now out in the Huntington Library, with campaign maps that are absolutely invaluable, including this one. And this one is really cool because our good buddy Lord Cantilupe pops up again. When I found Cantilupe's diary over in England, I found these two little watercolors in it. One of the Battle of Brandywine, and then this one. Now, Andre shows the Brigade of Guards sitting on this hill. There's a creek here, Trout Run, headquarters right across there, and then Light Dragoons. And lo and behold, our friend Cantilupe, on the afternoon of September 19th, sat down on that hillside and painted this little watercolor, called Light Dragoon Encampment at Tredyffrin, Pennsylvania, 1777. Now, here's the cool part. Obviously, Rembrandt didn't do this. Just a nice little watercolor. It's about this big. And we see little wigwams here. Oops. Got ahead of ourselves. Little wigwams. The British Army left most of their tents down on their ships, so they built these little lean-tos. There's a fence here, and looking at it closely, there were things here that were brown along the fence. I couldn't figure it out. And when I look in the magnifying glass, every one of them has a tail. They're horses tethered to this fence along what's now Contention Lane. Trout Run is right here because there's a horse drinking out of it and a couple of them over here. And then here's the giveaway. There's a dead tree right in the middle. Now, when you first look at that, this question comes to my head. Why did he paint a dead tree in the middle of the painting? What do you think the answer is? Why would he paint a dead tree in the middle of the painting? Because it was there. And people start laughing because they said, duh. And I said, wait a minute. Did Emanuel Leutze sit and paint Washington crossing the Delaware then? And the answer is no, he didn't. This was painted by an eyewitness at a given spot on a given time. When I came home after I found this in England, I went to the Chester County Historical Society and I asked them, because I know the folks there, and I said, what's the earliest image of Chester County that you have? And they said, this is a trick question, isn't it? And I said, all right, let me rephrase it. Do you have any images of Chester County landscape prior to the year 1800? And they said no. We did have an artist from Chester County, Benjamin West. He's most famous for the death of Wolfe at Quebec, but he was in England. The Quakers in this area didn't do art in those days. What you're looking at, folks, is the earliest known image of Chester County landscape. That and the Brandywine picture. It gets even stranger. If he put that kind of detail in there, what else is detailed? Well, the location of the Light Dragoon camp and then the shadows of the trees. We're looking south. It means the sun's over there. In the primary accounts, the guards were on that hill exactly one day because that night they were sent over here. In fact, they camped not a quarter of a mile from here because there were American troops hovering across the river. This is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, September 19th, 1777, the closest thing we have to a photograph. The only known image of an army camp on this campaign. You know how famous Valley Forge is? There's no drawings of it. We've got the French engineer's map, Duportail's map. As far as we haven't found any sketches of Valley Forge, here you have it. When people think, why would you go to England to find information on the American Revolution? It's hard not to laugh at them and say, because they were on the other side and they recorded a lot of this stuff. Okay, some of the best stuff that records what our countryside looked like in those days is over there. The hostility has faded away. We've moved on to other hostilities. But this is the sort of thing where when you find it, this is critical. Okay? So, there's the site today. This is the miracle of this. How many of you guys know where Tea Garden Park is? Oh, are you not from the immediate neighborhood? It's right off of Old State Road at Contention Lane. It's just a small park. The rest of that whole camp area has been developed. And the craziest thing of all is, it was developed in the 1960s. The developer named the road that goes around where the guards camp was on that hill, called it Coldstream Drive. Coldstream Guards? Yeah. Minor detail. Did he know what he was doing? Sure. He trashed it anyway. Howe's headquarters survives. General Kneippau's headquarters survives. Lord Cornwallis's headquarters still survives. It's got a swimming pool. And there's a cow in the backyard now, believe it or not. But anyway, this is what this British camp looked like. September 19th, they're set there. And over here, just down the road, down at the foot of the hill by where Washington's headquarters is the forge. And there were supplies stored there. 3,800 barrels of flour, 25 barrels of horseshoes, axe heads, kettles, 400 or 500 iron kettles, tomahawks, soap, and candles. And Army intelligence strikes again. The Continental Army sent 2 officers and 8 dragoons to move 3,800 barrels of flour, okay? Each barrel carrying 196 pounds of flour. So do the math. The guy who was commanding over there was famous, and his second in command was also very famous. These are a few American troops across the river, and the British get word that there's an American magazine here. This was 3 months before the camp. So they send 2 battalions of grenadiers, battalion of light infantry, and a handful of dragoons over to Valley Forge. There's a slight battle over there. Wayne withdraws to the camp above the Warren Tavern. The guy who was famous down here was Light Horse Harry Lee, who's a commander in the 3rd Continental Dragoons. He's Robert E. Lee's father. The other famous guy that was there was Alexander Hamilton, who was one of Washington's aides. They are the 2 officers, and there's 8 dragoons. Well, a tiny shooting match happened. Each side lost a horse, and the British won the Battle of Valley Forge. They occupied that area. 2 days later, the whole British Army is going to come through here. But first, Howe gets word that Wayne is behind him over here. Washington's army is up here at Reading Furnace. Wayne sent letters that could easily be considered insubordinate, practically ordering Washington to move the army down here to attack the British at Tredyffrin. Washington instead moves the Continental Army across the river at Parker's Ford. That Battle of the Cloud Storm had raised the river over its banks. We have accounts of these guys going across at Parker's Ford, the water's up to their necks. They linked arms and moved through the river in platoons with their muskets over their heads, soaked to the skin. They got over to Trap, where Reverend Henry Muhlenberg, who kept a beautiful journal for 40 years, he said they got there in the dark, and he said the guys are soaking wet. It's a chilly night. They're all going to get sick. That's an endless problem on this campaign. The guys getting sick by the hundreds. The British Army having the same problem. Washington, the morning of September 19th and 20th, is right across the river here, stretched from just past Perkiomen Creek all the way down to Norristown. And he's going to try to block the British advance. But Howe got word that Wayne was behind him. Wayne did not know that Washington had crossed the river. He assumed that when he told Washington to move and get down here, Washington would obey him. That's Anthony Wayne for you, okay? So there's reinforcements on the way from Maryland. General Smallwood is bringing up 2,000 Maryland militia, half of whom have no weapons, none of whom have any training. Smallwood was tearing what little hair he had left out. And as a result, we're going to get the Battle of Paoli. Howe decides to launch a night attack on Wayne's force with a battalion of light infantry, 2 regiments, some dragoons, and the most terrifying weapon of all, 600 Scottish Highlanders, who are going to advance silently. And there's Wayne's force. These are good soldiers. Lots of them are Scotch-Irish. They're frontiersmen. They're tough. They're pretty well drilled. Wayne is a bit of a martinet. He wants his guys to march as well as they can. You can see they're not in really good condition. And this is September. Imagine when they get here to Valley Forge after 3 more months of hard campaigning. Here's the British force coming at them. 12 British dragoons, British light infantry in the middle, and then Highlanders. There are only 1,200 British troops in the attack. Later accounts that are repeated endlessly will say the British attacked Wayne with 5,000 men. No, they didn't. 1,200, in the dark, silent, bayonets fixed, flints taken out of their muskets so their muskets won't fire. That way, when they do launch the attack, anybody that fires in the dark is an American. So this is going to happen at around midnight. Wayne is in this position. The British are going to send two forces. General Gray with his 1,200, they're going to attack Wayne at about midnight. Wayne had gotten 2 warnings hours before that he might get attacked. He was way too close to the British Army. He was a daredevil. And sure enough, they're going to turn around and smack him. And they did. This was one of the most brutal attacks in the Revolution. Most of Wayne's force will get away. Colonel Musgrave leads a British force of about 400 men to the Paoli Tavern. Some of them go over to Wayne's house. His brother-in-law tells us that they were very polite to the women. They said they simply wanted to see if the general was home. They were going to take him prisoner. Did not disturb the least article. Nor did they burn the house down, which is really astonishing. But Wayne's force got attacked. Smallwood with his Marylanders was about a mile away when the attack happened just after midnight. And the problem was when Wayne's men formed up, their campfires were behind them, so they were silhouetted. Wayne gave orders for them to move out of camp. And this is going to be a mess because the column will start moving out of camp and then it stops. They're faced in the opposite direction and the British attack comes in behind them. It's going to surround the rear of the American column like a horseshoe. And the British, once they come in the camp, are yelling at the top of their lungs. So it's terrifying. Panic is part of this. Some of the American troops stand firm and turn and fire. Others panic and run. The guys who panic and run are going to get creamed. There were fences all through this area too. And if you know where the Paoli Memorial Grounds are, the grave that's there, there's 52 guys. That was right at a fence line. Those soldiers piled up against that fence and tried to climb over it and got bayoneted. The total loss we're going to have at Paoli is at least 53 killed, about 150 to 200 wounded, 71 prisoners, and probably 200 or 300 guys disappeared. So for a total loss of about 500. The British lost 1 officer, a sergeant, and 2 men killed and 8 men wounded. And this is a nightmare battle. Smallwood's force, within a mile, they can hear this, and they're militia, so they're scared to death. And one of the Smallwood tells us himself that some of the British light infantry at that point were chasing the Americans and were actually firing at them, and they shot one of the Maryland militiamen, and the whole line panicked, dropped their muskets, and ran. Smallwood lost 1,000 men and 3 cannons that night, these guys disappearing into the countryside. He was furious. He and Mordecai Guest, they wrote to the governor of Maryland and said, I want every one of these guys arrested. Because what a disgrace. Okay. So Wayne, the next morning, writes, as his men have scattered in the dark with the British in pursuit for about a mile or so. That's where Smallwood has their nasty little encounter. Right out about where 352 and King Street come together. Again, that's all countryside in those days. So you have all of this scattering going on. Wayne's troops retreated that night from that site out to Lionville. The Euclid Meeting House was turned into a temporary hospital. Then he retreated all the way out to Jones's Tavern, which is in Elverson. Washington's army was still across the river, and the morning after Paoli, the British army moves into this camp here from about where you're sitting all the way to French Creek. We'll see a map that Andre drew. Washington received notice about this Battle of Paoli from Howe himself. He wrote Washington a very polite letter asking for surgeons for the American wounded. Washington was very cordial back, but the British courier went up the river a couple of miles and crossed at Long Ford, went through the entire American camp. No one challenged him. He was under a white flag, and he went to headquarters. And then went back to the British camp coming across Fatland Ford. Washington ordered the officers at Long Ford arrested and said a British flag crossed the river there, and no one challenged them. Do you realize what they're doing? They're measuring the depths of the river. That's exactly what the courier was doing, under a white flag. So sure enough, the next day when the British Army moves here, this is the map that Andre drew. We are sitting right about here. Here's Fatland Ford, where most of the Army crossed. He put that indication there. This is Washington's headquarters, the Potts House, Valley Creek. This is now Route 23. The Freedoms Foundation's right about here. Headquarters was right here near the Bull Tavern, right there at Pauling Road and Route 23. Pickering Creek, Moore Hall still there, and then all the way up here to French Creek. And these are all these British units camped along it. The British have a choice at this point, and their choice is they can go for Reading, which is a major army supply depot, or Lancaster, or Philadelphia. Washington has to try to guess which one he's going to go for. Hal knows that, so he's going to send a force. Washington had guards at these different fords. He's going to send a force up past French Creek and another one to cross at Gordon's Ford, where Phoenixville is, and make a lot of noise, fire some cannons, fire some shots. And then another force is actually going to cross down here at Fatland Ford. The guards are going to go across there. The Army is going to reverse its march. And that night, September 22nd, they're going to cross the Schuylkill River unopposed. And they're going to burn the forge that was down the road here. So the next morning, Washington is up in Pottsgrove Township. Howe is across the river over in Norriton, and Philadelphia is wide open. So that's how they're going to take Philadelphia, basically without a fight near the city. Congress had fled the city the morning of September 19th after a false rumor went through that the British had crossed the river. They went to Lancaster, but they didn't go straight to Lancaster. This is the first congressional junket. Had they come up the Lancaster Road, they would have walked into the British camp at Tredyffrin. They went to Bristol, then to Trenton, then to Easton, then to Bethlehem, then to Reading, then to Lancaster. They met for a day in Lancaster and realized they were still too close of danger, so they decided to go out to York, and that's how Congress ended up out there. All right, folks, my original intention tonight was to do only part of the campaign because trying to do the whole thing takes longer than an hour. If you would like to stay, it's up to you. I will, in honor of Sam Chu here, do a quick thing on the Battle of Germantown, which is the next big battle right after this. So you're welcome to stay for that. Might be 10 more minutes, then we'll have questions.